Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer never spent a single day on death row. Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty decades before his arrest, so instead, he lived behind bars knowing he would die there, which he did, brutally beaten to death by a fellow inmate in 1994. But perhaps what's most chilling isn't how he died, but what authorities discovered in his Milwaukee apartment on July 22, 1991. A human head in the refrigerator, a freezer packed with body parts, and photographs of dismembered victims arranged like trophies. Dahmer had killed 17 young men and boys, preserving their remains because, as he would later confess, he didn't want them to leave him. To understand how an American boy became one of history's most notorious serial killers, we need to go back to where it all began, to a seemingly ordinary childhood that held the seeds of unimaginable horror. Hit that like button and subscribe to be part of our growing community. Also, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from as we dive into this chilling story. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His father was a chemistry student working toward his degree, while his mother struggled with severe anxiety and depression throughout her pregnancy. Joyce's condition required heavy medication, and she spent much of her time in bed, already creating an atmosphere of tension before Jeffrey even entered the world. For the first few years, Jeffrey seemed like a normal, happy child, energetic and curious, loved by both parents who were trying to build a stable life. But things began to shift when the family moved to Bath, Ohio, in 1966. Lionel had earned his PhD and secured a job as an analytical chemist, and the Dahmers settled into a house surrounded by woods. It was isolated, quiet, the kind of place where a child's imagination could run wild. Jeffrey was 6 years old, and outwardly, life looked perfect. But inside the house, his parents' marriage was crumbling. Joyce's mental health deteriorated further, and she became increasingly demanding and volatile. Lionel buried himself in work, leaving young Jeffrey caught in the crossfire of their constant arguments. Around this time, something changed in Jeffrey. The bright, sociable boy began to withdraw. He became fascinated with dead animals, not in the way curious children sometimes are, but with an intensity that disturbed those who noticed. When he was 8, Lionel found him collecting the bones of animals killed by traffic on the nearby roads. Jeffrey would bleach them, preserve them, even dissect them to see what was inside. His father, a chemist himself, didn't see this as alarming at first. He thought it was scientific curiosity, perhaps even a sign his son might follow in his footsteps. He showed Jeffrey how to properly clean and preserve the bones using chemicals. It was a bonding activity, father and son together. Neither of them could have known they were nurturing something dark. By the time Jeffrey entered his teenage years, the warning signs became impossible to ignore, at least in retrospect. He was painfully shy at Revere High School, a loner who drank heavily even during school hours. Classmates remember him arriving drunk, acting out for attention in bizarre ways, faking epileptic seizures in the hallways, making strange noises, anything to be noticed. They called these performances doing a Dahmer. But beneath the class clown act was a boy drowning in confusion, isolation, and urges he didn't understand and couldn't tell anyone about. He was realizing he was gay in 1970s suburban Ohio, where that truth felt like a death sentence. Worse, his sexual awakening was tangled with violent fantasies that terrified even him. At home, things reached a breaking point. In 1977, when Jeffrey was 17, his parents' divorce became final. Joyce moved out, taking Jeffrey's younger brother David with her, but leaving Jeffrey behind with his father, who was often away for work. For a brief period, Jeffrey lived completely alone in that isolated house in the woods, unsupervised, drinking heavily, and sinking deeper into his darkest thoughts. What happened next would change everything. Because within a year of his parents' separation, Jeffrey Dahmer would commit his first murder and discover that the fantasies in his head could become horrifyingly real. The first kill and the beginning of a nightmare. The summer of 1978 should have been a time of celebration for Jeffrey Dahmer. He had just graduated from Revere High School that May, and like thousands of other 18-year-olds across America, he stood on the edge of adulthood with his whole life ahead of him. But Jeffrey wasn't celebrating. His parents' bitter divorce had just finalized. His mother had taken his younger brother and left Ohio, and his father had temporarily moved out to live with his new girlfriend. Jeffrey was completely alone in the family home on Bath Road, surrounded by woods, with nothing but his alcohol addiction and his increasingly violent fantasies for company. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after his high school graduation, Jeffrey was drinking and driving aimlessly around the area when he spotted a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks. Stephen was a good-looking young man with long hair, heading to a rock concert. He'd just spent the day at a music festival and was trying to make his way home. When Jeffrey pulled over and offered him a ride, Stephen climbed in without hesitation. Why wouldn't he? Jeffrey seemed like just another teenager, someone normal. But Jeffrey didn't take Stephen where he wanted to go. Instead, he convinced the young man to come back to his house for a few beers and to hang out. Stephen agreed. Maybe he was in no rush. Maybe he sensed a loneliness in Jeffrey that felt harmless. They spent hours at the Dahmer house, drinking, talking, listening to music. For those brief hours, Jeffrey had what he desperately wanted: company, someone who wouldn't leave him. But when Stephen eventually said he needed to go, something inside Jeffrey snapped. He couldn't let him leave. He wouldn't. Jeffrey grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell and struck Stephen twice in the head from behind while the young man sat in a chair. Stephen collapsed, and Jeffrey strangled him with the barbell to make sure he was dead. Then, with Stephen's body still warm, Jeffrey sexually assaulted the corpse. The fantasy that had lived only in Jeffrey's mind, the desire to possess someone completely, to keep them from leaving, to have total control over another person's body, had become horrifyingly real. And now he had a body in his house, and he was utterly alone with what he had done. What followed was a horror that would set the pattern for all of Jeffrey's future crimes. He dragged Stephen's body to the crawl space beneath the house, where it remained for several hours while Jeffrey tried to figure out what to do. The next day, he dismembered the corpse, cutting it into pieces. He packed the remains into garbage bags and buried them in the woods behind his house. But paranoia set in. What if someone found them? What if animals dug them up? Days later, he returned to the burial site, dug up the bags, stripped the flesh from the bones, and crushed the bones into fragments with a sledgehammer. He scattered the pieces throughout the wooded property, trying to make Stephen Hicks disappear forever. For nearly 9 years, he succeeded. Stephen's family reported him missing immediately, but there were no leads, no witnesses, no body. Stephen Mark Hicks simply vanished that June night, and no one connected his disappearance to the awkward, quiet teenager who lived alone in that house in the woods. 9 years of silence. Then the killing begins again. After murdering Stephen Hicks, something unexpected happened. Jeffrey stopped. For 9 years, he didn't kill again. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after 1 semester due to his drinking and failing grades. In January 1979, his father convinced him to enlist in the Army, hoping military structure might straighten him out. Jeffrey became a medical specialist and was stationed in Germany, but his alcoholism only worsened. He was discharged in 1981 for habitual drunkenness, his military career lasting less than 3 years. He drifted after that, living with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, working low-wage jobs, getting arrested twice for indecent exposure and sexual misconduct. His grandmother Catherine was patient and loving, trying to help her troubled grandson, but she couldn't see what was building inside him. The urge to kill hadn't disappeared. It had merely been dormant, waiting. In September 1987, Jeffrey met 25-year-old Stephen Twomey at a gay bar in Milwaukee called Club 219. They got a room at the Ambassador Hotel, and both men drank heavily. Jeffrey would later claim he didn't remember killing Stephen, that he woke up the next morning to find Stephen dead beside him in bed, blood coming from his mouth, with bruises on his chest and arms suggesting he'd been beaten. Whether this was true or a convenient lie, Stephen Twomey became Jeffrey's second victim. Panicked, Jeffrey bought a large suitcase, stuffed the body inside, and took a taxi back to his grandmother's house, where he sexually assaulted the corpse before dismembering Stephen in the basement. He put the remains in garbage bags and disposed of them with the regular trash pickup. This time, Jeffrey didn't stop. The 9-year gap was over, and the killings began to accelerate with terrifying speed. The pattern of horror. Between September 1987 and July 1991, less than 4 years, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 15 more young men. The pattern became horrifyingly consistent, refined with each victim as Jeffrey perfected his method of capturing, controlling, and destroying human lives. He would meet them at gay bars, bathhouses, or on the streets of Milwaukee's predominantly gay neighborhoods. He targeted young men who were often marginalized, gay men of color, men who were struggling financially, men who were less likely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. He promised them money for photo sessions, offered them drinks, presented himself as friendly and harmless. Once they agreed to come back to his apartment, his careful plan would unfold. Jeffrey would prepare drinks laced with powerful sedatives, typically crushed sleeping pills mixed into rum and coke or other cocktails. He would wait for the drugs to take effect, watching as his victims became drowsy, disoriented, and eventually unconscious or barely conscious. In this vulnerable state, unable to resist or escape, Jeffrey would sexually assault them. He would then strangle them to death, usually manually or with a leather strap, maintaining physical contact as the life drained from their bodies. But death didn't end Jeffrey's crimes. It was merely the beginning of what he truly wanted. After killing his victims, he would spend hours, sometimes days, with their bodies. He would engage in necrophilia, photographing the corpses from various angles, posing them, documenting his absolute power over them. He told psychiatrists later that this was when he felt most satisfied, when his victims were completely passive, completely his, incapable of ever leaving him. Then came the dismemberment. Jeffrey would methodically cut apart the bodies in his bathtub, a process he'd perfected over time. He kept Polaroid photographs of each stage, the whole body, the dismemberment process, the individual parts. These photographs served as trophies, memories he could revisit whenever he wanted. He kept certain body parts, skulls that he would paint and display, genitals preserved in formaldehyde, torsos dissolving in a barrel of acid. He even admitted to eating portions of some victims' bodies, claiming it made him feel like they were becoming part of him, that he could keep them with him forever. His victims during this period included 22-year-old Richard Guerrero, who disappeared in March 1988 after meeting Jeffrey at a bar. Jeffrey strangled him, sexually assaulted his corpse, then dismembered him and disposed of the remains in the trash. Anthony Sears, a 26-year-old aspiring model, was killed in March 1989. Jeffrey kept his skull and genitals, painting the skull gray to make it look like a plastic model so his grandmother wouldn't notice it in his bedroom. The murders continued even after Jeffrey moved into his own apartment, Oxford Apartments, Unit 213, at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, in May 1990. Raymond Smith, 32, also known as Ricky Beeks, disappeared in May 1990. Jeffrey drugged him, sexually assaulted him, strangled him, photographed his body, and engaged in necrophilia before dismemberment. Edward Smith, 28, met the same fate in June 1990. Ernest Miller, 22, a dance student with a bright future, was killed in September 1990. Jeffrey kept his entire skeleton, bleaching the bones and storing them in his apartment. David Thomas, 23, was murdered in September 1990. Curtis Straughter, 18, disappeared in February 1991. Errol Lindsay, 19, was killed in April 1991. Tony Hughes, 31, who was deaf and mute, was murdered in May 1991. Jeffrey had communicated with Tony through written notes before drugging and killing him, then keeping his body in his bedroom for several days before dismemberment. Matt Turner, 20, was killed in June 1991. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23, died in July 1991. Jeffrey kept his head in the freezer. Oliver Lacey, 24, was murdered on July 15, 1991, just a week before Jeffrey's arrest. His head was found in the refrigerator, his heart in the freezer. Jeffrey later admitted he'd intended to eat the heart. Joseph Braidhoft, 25, became Jeffrey's final victim on July 19, 1991, just 3 days before Jeffrey was finally caught. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began on January 30, 1992, in Milwaukee County Circuit Court, with Judge Lawrence Graham presiding. Jeffrey had already pleaded guilty to 15 murders in Wisconsin. The Stephen Hicks murder in Ohio would be handled separately. Because he'd pleaded guilty, There would be no jury deliberation on whether he'd committed the crimes. That was established fact. Instead, the trial became what's called a sanity hearing, where the jury's only job was to determine whether Jeffrey was legally sane or insane at the time of the murders. Defense attorney Gerald Boyle brought in psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Berlin, who testified that Jeffrey suffered from necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses, a mental disease that drove his compulsion to kill. The defense argued that Jeffrey's urges were so overwhelming, so beyond his control, that he couldn't be held fully responsible under the law. Dr. Judith Becker, another defense psychiatrist, supported this view, painting Jeffrey as a deeply disturbed man whose mental illness dictated his actions. But the prosecution dismantled it. He knew what he was doing was wrong, Dr. Dietz testified. He took elaborate steps to avoid detection. That demonstrates he understood the wrongfulness of his conduct and could control it. The most emotionally devastating moments of the trial came when family members of Jeffrey's victims took the stand or addressed the court. On February 15, 1992, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They had heard 2 weeks of psychiatric testimony, seen the horrific evidence, and listened to Jeffrey's own confession played in the courtroom. On February 17, 1992, Judge Graham sentenced Jeffrey Dahmer to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, a total of 957 years without the possibility of parole. Later that same year, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to the 1978 murder of Stephen Hicks in Ohio and received an additional life sentence. Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, to begin serving his life sentences. The world thought it had seen the last of Jeffrey Dahmer. But his story had one final, violent chapter left to unfold. At first, prison officials placed Jeffrey in protective custody, isolated from the general population for his own safety. Serial killers, especially those who prey on vulnerable people, are universally despised in prison, even among other violent criminals. Child killers and those who committed sexual crimes occupy the lowest rung of the prison hierarchy, and Jeffrey's crimes were so horrific that he was an instant target. He spent his first year in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, allowed out only for showers and brief periods of exercise in an enclosed area where he couldn't interact with other inmates. During those isolated months, something unexpected began to happen. Jeffrey started corresponding with his father, Lionel, who visited him regularly despite the unimaginable shame and horror of having raised a serial killer. Lionel wrote a book called A Father's Story, trying to make sense of how his son became a monster. In their conversations, Lionel, a devout Christian, urged Jeffrey to turn to God, to seek redemption for his soul, even if the law would never set him free. In May 1994, Jeffrey was baptized in the prison whirlpool by a local minister, Roy Ratcliffe. Jeffrey claimed he'd found Christianity, that he was reading the Bible daily, and that he finally understood the full weight of what he'd done. He gave several interviews from prison, most notably with Stone Phillips on NBC's Dateline, where he spoke calmly about his crimes and claimed he felt genuine remorse. "I've hurt a lot of people," Jeffrey said during the interview. "I should have stayed with God. He could have helped me." Jeffrey told psychiatrists and journalists that he was plagued by nightmares about his victims, that their faces haunted him, that he wished he could take it all back. He said he deserved to die for what he'd done and that he didn't fear death. In fact, he expected it. "I don't think I'm going to heaven," he told one interviewer. "I think I'm going to be with Satan." In July 1994, after serving just over 2 years of his sentence, Jeffrey was moved from protective custody into the general population at the Columbia Correctional Institution. This decision shocked many people. Why would prison officials put America's most notorious serial killer among other violent inmates? Some speculated it was a bureaucratic decision based on Jeffrey's reportedly good behavior. Others whispered darker theories, that officials knew exactly what would happen and simply looked the other way. Jeffrey was assigned to work detail in the prison gym alongside other inmates. He scrubbed floors, cleaned equipment, and tried to stay invisible. But you can't be invisible when you're Jeffrey Dahmer. Other inmates taunted him, threatened him, and made it clear he wasn't safe. Jeffrey told his father during visits that he feared for his life, that he knew someone would eventually kill him. But he also said he accepted that fate. "I deserve whatever happens to me," he told Lionel. The morning of November 28, 1994, started like any other day in prison for Jeffrey Dahmer. It was the Monday after Thanksgiving, and Jeffrey was assigned to work detail in the prison gymnasium. He woke early, ate breakfast in his cell, prison food served on a plastic tray, nothing special, and spent some time reading his Bible, as had become his routine. Guards came to escort him and two other inmates to their work assignment around 8 a.m. Jeffrey didn't know it would be his last morning. There were no visitors scheduled, no final phone calls to his father, no dramatic last words prepared. Just another day of mopping floors and trying to survive in a place where everyone wanted him dead. The other two inmates assigned to work detail that morning were Christopher Scarver, a 35-year-old man serving a life sentence for murder, and Jesse Anderson, another convicted killer. The three men were left relatively unsupervised in the gymnasium bathroom and locker room area, a decision that would prove fatal. A guard was supposed to check on them every 15 minutes, but on this particular morning, those checks were irregular. Christopher Scarver had been carrying a 20-inch metal bar from the prison weight room, hidden in his clothing. Scarver despised Jeffrey Dahmer. He later said he was repulsed by Jeffrey's crimes and disturbed by Jeffrey's behavior in prison. Jeffrey apparently had a dark sense of humor, sometimes fashioning his prison food into body parts and dousing them with ketchup to look like blood, mocking his own crimes. Whether this was true or just Scarver's justification for what came next, we'll never know for certain. Around 8:10 a.m., Scarver attacked. He struck Jeffrey in the head and face repeatedly with the metal bar, beating him with savage force. Jeffrey tried to crawl away but couldn't escape. Scarver then turned on Jesse Anderson, beating him as well. When guards finally arrived, somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes after the inmates had been left alone, they found both Jeffrey and Anderson unconscious, bleeding heavily from massive head trauma. Jeffrey Dahmer was still alive, barely. Paramedics rushed him to Divine Savior Hospital in Portage, but his injuries were catastrophic. His skull was fractured, his brain severely damaged. At 9:11 a.m., just over an hour after the attack began, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was pronounced dead. He was 34 years old. Jesse Anderson died 2 days later from his injuries. There was no last meal, no final statement, no moment of reflection before witnesses. Jeffrey's death was brutal, sudden, and violent, a fate eerily similar to what he'd inflicted on his 17 victims. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. News of Jeffrey Dahmer's death spread quickly. The reactions were mixed and complicated. Many of the victims' families expressed relief, even satisfaction. Others, including Jeffrey's father Lionel, were devastated. Despite everything, Lionel had held on to hope that his son's religious conversion was real, that Jeffrey had genuinely found remorse in his final years. I really think that if Jeff had not been killed in prison, he could have helped a lot of people, Lionel said. He could have talked about what happened to him, what made him that way. Jeffrey's mother, Joyce Flint, who had long been estranged from her son, reportedly showed little emotion upon hearing of his death. Christopher Scarver was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for killing Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson. He pleaded guilty and received 2 additional life sentences, to be served consecutively with his existing sentence. Scarver later gave interviews claiming that God had told him to kill Jeffrey, that he was doing divine work by ridding the world of a monster. Prison officials faced intense scrutiny over how Scarver had obtained a metal weapon and why 3 violent inmates had been left relatively unsupervised together, but no officers were ever charged with negligence. Jeffrey's brain was preserved after his autopsy, with scientists hoping to study it for abnormalities that might explain his behavior. But his mother Joyce fought to have his brain cremated, arguing that her son deserved to be laid to rest in peace. After a bitter legal battle, a judge ordered Jeffrey's brain destroyed. His body was cremated, and his ashes were divided between his parents. There is no grave, no marker, no place where Jeffrey Dahmer's physical remains exist. He disappeared from the world as completely as he'd tried to make his victims disappear. The families of Jeffrey's 17 victims had to carry on with their lives, forever changed by what he'd done. Some found solace in religion, others in activism, working to improve how missing persons cases are handled, especially when the victims are from marginalized communities. Many of Jeffrey's victims were young gay men of color, and there's an uncomfortable truth that their disappearances weren't investigated as thoroughly as they should have been. Would Jeffrey have been caught sooner if his victims had been white, straight, or from wealthier backgrounds? It's a question that haunts the case to this day. Jeffrey's apartment building, the Oxford Apartments where so much horror unfolded, was eventually demolished in 1992. The city of Milwaukee wanted to erase the physical reminder of the nightmare that had occurred there. The lot remained empty for years before being redeveloped. People still avoid mentioning the address, as if speaking it aloud might somehow resurrect the evil that lived there. Jeffrey Dahmer's story doesn't end with neat conclusions or satisfying answers. He confessed to everything, was convicted, and died violently in prison, but the deeper questions remain unresolved. Was he born evil, or was he made that way by his troubled childhood, his parents' divorce, his untreated mental illness, and his isolation? Could his crimes have been prevented if someone, anyone, had intervened earlier? And perhaps most troubling of all, did justice truly require that Jeffrey Dahmer die violently at the hands of another killer, or does that simply make us complicit in the same cycle of violence we claim to condemn? Can a monster find redemption, or are some crimes simply beyond forgiveness? Was Jeffrey Dahmer's brutal murder in prison the justice his victims deserved, perpetuating the same cycle of violence instead of breaking it? Share your thoughts below. I love to hear them. And hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next case.